Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from University of Central Florida to spend a little bit of time talking about policy and change. Maybe you've heard that saying, nothing changes, nothing stays the same. Well, change is inevitable for better or for worse. The first thing I'd like to do is introduce the concept of paradigm, and George Ritzer in his 1975 book defined paradigm as the broadest unit of consensus within a science and serves to differentiate one scientific community from another. It subsumes, defines, and interrelates the exemplars, theories, and methods and instruments that exist within it. And that is a quote from page 7. Now, the interesting feature of paradigm is basically that's the way that we practice our science, which would mean that there are different paradigms in the policy analysis region. And I think really what we start getting at is the whole idea that paradigms are the models, basically, that define how we conduct our work, how we think about things, how we present things. And so I'm going to kind of borrow this term from the scientific field and move from paradigm as being a model, for example, psychoanalysis, cognitive behavioral therapy, strain theory, conflict theory, and move it more to look at policy paradigms or models. And a lot of this comes out of Thomas Kuhn's book on the structure of scientific revolutions. And this book came out in 1970. And Kuhn traced the changes in physics, but this has often been applied in other fields as well, for example, in sociology and psychology. And the whole idea is that scientific paradigms move through certain stages. And in other words, there's a paradigm that's being used, paradigm 1, the current paradigm, the popular paradigm, if you will, and during that time normal science occurs until there's anomalies. And then this leads to a crisis and a revolution, and a new paradigm, or paradigm 2, takes over. And then, of course, paradigm 2 becomes common practice, and then we move back to the whole thing of normal science, anomalies, crisis, and revolution. Now, the whole idea here is that that I'm bringing in is that policies may operate as paradigms and may go through a variety of changes, moving from policy as usual business. When anomalies begin to occur, there's policy crisis, which leads to policy revolutions and a new policy that will replace the old one until a better one model comes around. So some questions I have to ask here are, for example, does policy change operate this way? That I'm not familiar with research that shows that this can be supported or not. And is there a cyclical view of policy? And how are policies differentiated? And how are policies similar and different to scientific paradigms? The example I might use is that there's a certain program I'm aware of, and the policy is to implement this particular program to reduce a criminal justice problem. And the research has shown over and over and over and over again that this program does not work. In fact, I highly recommend that people who fund this program just give me the money, because I won't do any damage with it. I'll do something else with it, but they might as well, or use the money in a different program that has a different focus that might work. So the whole thing here is the policies want to address this problem, and then we have these methods of implementing this policy, which is a program, and the program doesn't work. And I think what we're doing is that for some reason, this crisis, the anomalies, first of all, have been denied by many, and there has not been a crisis, therefore no revolution. Although there's some other programs that are showing positive effects that may go ahead and replace this program slowly. Or maybe the program that's currently running that doesn't work will somehow obtain the new program that shows more of a positive benefit and start using that. Interesting features here, and again, I'm kind of treading water, if you will, in trying to apply policies to these scientific paradigms. I'm really stretching it here. So according to looking at Thomas Kuhn's research in scientific revolutions and thinking about policies, there's often paradigm competition in the early stages of science, of a particular science. Now, I will translate that for our purposes. There's often policy competition in early stages of policy making over a particular issue. So there's competition between policymakers and stakeholders. And when one policy is agreed upon, then we begin to see normal policy practiced in that community. And usually people will try to ignore the few research studies that start to come in that contradict that particular policy or move the idea along that we go with another policy. Kuhn states on page 14 in his book that to be accepted as a paradigm, a theory must seem better than its competitors, but it need not, and in fact never does explain all the facts with which it can be confronted. So therefore, paradigms and of course policies are incomplete. And so Kuhn points out that that this is an ongoing issue that can lead to these crises and revolutions. Now, we get into the whole idea of different points of view and what happens when there are anomalies or conflicts or inconsistencies in policies. According to Kuhn, when a paradigm fails to explain a phenomena or fails to solve a puzzle, a crisis occurs and there's competition and conflict between paradigms. And I would say this occurs with policies. When a policy fails to explain a phenomena or deal with a particular issue successfully, a crisis occurs, and then there's competition between that policy and alternative policies. And when a policy revolution materializes, it becomes apparent that the new policy is inconsistent with the old one. And so these situations cannot be ignored or explained away, as Sheed Cook points out in a 1986 article. So we ask, well, what can happen? Kolko and Horan in 1983 look at when a crisis state exists within a dominant paradigm. There's three possibilities that may occur. That the paradigm, or in our case, the policy problems and puzzles, may be resolved. Two, the competition between paradigms, or in our case, policies, may lead to multiple paradigms or policies. And three, the old paradigm or policy is replaced by a new paradigm or policy. And of course, the big question is, do policies follow this pattern? I'm just giving you a model here that I think may have some, some use in policy analysis and looking at policy change. And we also want to look at some features about how large the change would be regarding the policy. Do we tweak policy slightly, or do we make major changes? And of course, then we look at barriers to change. And I'm borrowing from Burroughs and Need's 2009 article, Time to Contemplate Change, a framework for assessing readiness to change with offenders, from Aggression and Violent Behavior, volume 14, pages 39 to 49. Let's talk about these barriers to change for a few minutes, because I think they relate to policies. So I'm borrowing from other areas, of course, which is an interesting feature when you start thinking about different scientific paradigms. And sometimes I'm all over the place. And I think that's okay as long as we keep things consistent and logical. Some of the barriers to change, for example, are perceived, for example, the importance of the change, or importance of the policy for that matter, or the need for the policy or change, the personal responsibility for change. And I would say this leads to group responsibility as well. The urgency, the ability to change, the ability to maintain changes, the costs, that certainly is a big one, and the suitability and efficacy to change. Also, I think we need to look at the realities behind the change itself. And we also may ask, what does change look like? And so we can think about the number of choices, the diversity of beliefs, the time orientation, the size of the change, the networks that are created or maintained, the blockages, the expectations, and so forth. And of course, the indicators and ways we evaluate what the effects were of change, in this case, policy. as we're talking about changing minds, changing policies, if we think about how change may occur, there's different areas, and this may relate to policies too. Invention, discovery, diffusion, demographic changes, technological changes, social movements leading to changes, and the like. I kind of see it in the sense that we can borrow from other fields or other findings and apply it. In some ways, what I'm doing is setting up a situation where I create or borrow and bring something in that's new. And some would argue that, well, what about the stuff that has been used for years and years and years? And my response is, well, if it's working, that's great. If it's not, we need to do something else. Now, my own area in looking at policy and change and would be genocide prevention, which is a huge area in that sense. The big question is, what policies do we set up, or even laws for that matter, or procedures to prevent genocide? Now, I'm not going to get into any of that now because that would take up a lot of time. But the whole point is I borrow and look at policies that come from different fields of study, law, sociology, criminal justice, criminology, anthropology, sociology, and so forth, and try to think about well, what's going on here. And then I have a theory I use that comes out of sociology, and I apply that to genocide prevention. And so I pull from that, well, the policy basically would be to implement these particular strategies to reduce the risk of genocide. An example that may be a little more relevant as it relates to changes and policies, and one that many of my students who are involved in the criminal justice system as law enforcement professionals, corrections professionals, attorneys, and so on, and students who are preparing careers in the criminal justice field, this may relate a little bit more. A lot of times when I talk about genocide, genocide theory, genocide prevention, it seems like it's so out there. You know, when I say, well, I'm using the same theories that I use to describe and explain bullying and bullying prevention in some ways, and people get a little confused saying, how can you possibly apply a theory of bullying to and a theory of genocide and say you're using the same theoretical base? Well, changes in policing, and I'm going to draw from the article by Bailey in 1998, Policing in America from Society, volume 36, pages 15 to 19. And a couple of interesting features here. And Bailey looks at changes in the past 30 years, so we have to say changes in the last 45 years perhaps, and update this. But I think it's real relevant. Some of the changes that we've seen are the responsiveness to citizens, public accountability, and openness to evaluation. We're seeing a lot more citizen input in policing, and among law enforcement professionals, we're seeing increased education and skills, the increased use of scientific research, increased standards, increased diversity, and increased review by civilians. Okay, so there's some of the patterns and trends. So those are changes also we've seen. And so, you know, in some sense, some might say we're getting a lot of new policies related to policing and new policing paradigms, if you will. Now, McGuire and King, in their 2004 article, Trends in the Policing Industry from the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences, volume 593, pages 15 to 41, point out some major changes taking place in policing, and this also would relate to policies that are made in police departments. For example, private policing, policing terrorism, militarization of police, policing risk, socializing children, community policing and problem solving, increased growth, increased diversity. Now, you know, thinking about any of those, so for example, socializing children, where there's new policies for police officers to go into the school systems and have more contact with, you know, students, young students, and their parents or caretakers, and to try to resolve problems at that level and try to prevent drug substance abuse, try to prevent gang membership and involvement, try to increase the cohesion relationships between police officers and young students, with the idea that as they get older, they'll continue this relationship, and this will all lead to basically reduction in crime, because you'll have a whole group of children being socialized to into a model where they're more likely to be law-abiding citizens. In contrast, some would argue that police officers really have taken on the role of social workers in the school system, and psychiatrists and psychologists, and they're there to provide therapy. Or others would argue, well, they're really there as parents doing the parental role. So you get all these different debates, which are the paradigms, and then we see policies related to those programs that are implemented based on these policies. We also see the increased use of civilians. Neighborhood watch is a huge issue in debate in the last couple of years, and how that relates also to surveillance and other features related to police work. And as I mentioned before, and they mentioned increased education in policing and use of the research. Also, we've seen organizational structural changes and new networks and relationships with other organizations. Especially since 9/11, I think we've seen a lot more data sharing and information sharing among police and law enforcement and other relevant agencies. Also, federalization and globalization and technological innovation. I think the policies related to technological innovation are fascinating to study, and we could have, again, huge amount of discussion on that. Just think about the technology and the policies that are generated related to technology innovation. So a lot of different features related to change, and I'll finally wrap up by kind of asking you the question: what happens when policies fail, or the government fails to respond to criminal justice issues? What can we do, and how can we use the model that I presented, Kuhn's scientific structure, and looking at the paradigm model and paradigm change? How can we apply that? How does it relate to policies? And maybe this helps you a little bit in thinking about policy change, changing minds, bringing in certain policies for comparative purposes, and then trying to find out what works best and is most effective and cost effective in that sense, and also acceptable to the community. And how can we evaluate these policies with particular standards, and really bring the science into it as well. Of course, the final thought I'll leave you with, because I've gone way long for this particular YouTube video, is I just forgot my thought. That's what happens when I go past the 15 minutes. Oh, I just got it back. Okay, my thought was that the main thing I think of importance, and that's what I have you doing with reading Gardner's Changing Minds, and then thinking about, how do you convince someone to accept a policy, is presenting the policy to the public and to the organizations and agencies and stakeholders that will adopt it. That is probably the key. And I told you, I am more on the research end of things. I'm a little rough around the edges when it comes to public relations and all that marketing stuff. You're not going to see me out there in a fancy suit pushing a policy to some big group. In fact, back in the 80s, and I worked in a organization, a large agency, I went out in the community in presentations, and eventually they pulled me from that, and they said that I had poor PR skills, and that I was an excellent researcher and evaluator, and the best thing was to just put me in an office and lock the door and let me interact with my colleagues, and let me present to them how to present and how to bring the data and how to do all this. They'll do the marketing job. Perhaps I should have had a bachelor's degree in theater, which might have helped me in that route. But anyway, this wraps up this video. Have a nice day or evening.